Thank you, kia ora. It's great to be here, great to be involved, and from listening to Tina yesterday morning through to Jeff last night, this whole looking after our environment thing has really been pretty compelling and has hit me pretty hard. So just before I introduce Jim, I thought I'd just let you know, in 2008 I was fortunate, I was at the Olympic Games in Beijing and they were fantastic. But it wasn't until the games were over, the closing ceremony was fantastic, but Beijing had made every company shut down all their operations during the Olympic Games. And it was, I think, a Monday morning we got up to fly home, and we went to the hotel to check out, and they're giving everybody face masks to get in the cab to run out to the airport to fly home. So the smog, the smoke was phenomenal, something I've never experienced in my life. So it was quite lucky. I was sitting by the window in the airplane, and as we took off, I thought I'd time it until I saw clean air. And I know, Boeings go pretty quick when they take off. 8 minutes before we saw what we see every day here. So it's just sort of been riding in the back of my mind. So little story, but I move on to, it's a real thrill to have Jim Kelly with us here from Australia. The Chamber Executive made a conscious decision. Look, we're independent, we're here to promote and work with businesses, who are the backbone of our community. And one of the topics came along, what about the water? We know 5 million cubic metres out into the ocean every year, 5 million, and we're pumping it, and surely there's got to be a better way. So thanks to Activate Tairawhiti, they gave us some funding, and we said we want to look at this as an independent organisation, look at it a bit differently. Just, can it be done? We know in Gisborne even we have the expertise, and as Wolfgang alluded to in the report, we know it can be done, and Jim will probably beat us up and say, just, the old Nike logo, just do it, is probably what's going to come through. But as we just looked at it more, my sort of way of looking at wastewater now is it's a liquid gold, it's not used, and here's potentially the opportunity for us to do it. So with that little ramble, I'll just pick out some things from Jim's bio. I've been asking for this, but he's been so wrapped up in wastewater. He said, I'll bring it on my computer and put it in front of you now. But managing director of a boutique consulting firm with soil and plant scientists, water scientists, engineers and communication teams, 20 years experience in broadacre agriculture, horticulture, water recycling, research and development. In the area of water recycling, Jim has undertaken 5 years of research into the sustainable irrigation of the horticulture crops with reclaimed water, 7 years as the National Coordinator for Recycled Water Development in Horticulture. He's led 4 international study tours on water recycling and innovative water use, produced a wide range of resources. To sum it up, Jim is unapologetic advocate for all things wastewater. Jim Kelly.
Thank you. It's you always grab one of these and you're never quite sure which button to push, but it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'll apologise first of all. My wife tells me I'm an incredible mumbler, so if I mumble away, shoot me down and ask me questions. But what I've done is prepared a presentation, and the presentation is much larger than I would give here today. But the presentation is for you, on the council or whoever will have this at the end of it, and I'm quite happy for it to be shared around. And so there's facts and figures in there that we will address. Water recycling and sustainability. It's really interesting. Sustainable irrigation with recycled water and sustainability, they fit hand in hand. You just can't ignore it. It is a fantastic opportunity. For example, on the Northern Adelaide Plains, which is a region, I'll use the term Virginia Pipeline Scheme and Northern Adelaide Plains interchangeably. And that's where the foundation research was undertaken in the sustainable irrigation of horticultural crops with recycled water. Each year they're dumping $2 million worth of nitrogen into the bay and nearly the same amount of phosphorus. And also they're putting in excess of $6 million worth of water. So it just doesn't make sense. If you grow up in the driest state in the driest inhabited continent, it doesn't make sense. I was saying before to somebody, we have a little joke in South Australia, when it rained for 40 days and 40 nights in the Bible, Adelaide got 10 points, and that's about right. So the drying climate. But also the other thing is, when you look at the nutrients in the water, you see that boy sitting down there, who would have thought? Well, it's true. Every time you go to the toilet and urinate, there's enough nutrient for a loaf of bread. So why are we sending this out to the ocean? So if you want to talk sustainability, and I think the take-home message has to be today is A, it's doable, but the second thing is that it is incredibly safe. One of the things I can tell you about my learnings with recycled water is that the safeguards that are put in place are far greater than the safeguards for any other water. And it was interesting today to watch the council presentation and the level of E. coli. So the level of E. coli in recycled water delivered to growers on the Northern Adelaide Plains is 0. So it is the only water where farmers in Australia, recycled water is the only water in farmers in Australia really know what the water quality is going on to vegetables. So the River Murray, when it comes down and we have a flood, the growers will start irrigating and they'll have 400 E. coli per 100 mils of water. So it's really significant. So I think what you have to do is you have to take your hat off, take a deep breath and go forward. Recycled water. In Australia we changed the name. By definition, scientifically, it is reclaimed water. Reclaimed water is water that you reclaim from another purpose and bring back onto another property for another use. So technically it was reclaimed water, but part of building community trust and people trust was to rebrand it as recycled water. Everybody is familiar with water, is familiar with recycling, and it has a very, very positive connotation. So that's what we went. Uses of recycled water, it's used for everything in Australia. It's used for everything around the world. This is not new. It is used for washing. I've been to the Tampa Bay baseball arena, and they use recycled water in the cooling towers there. And it's not very well treated. The air is separated from the recycled water. So it can be used for an enormous number of things. And firefighting, environmental flows, wetland, recreational uses, groundwater. We went to a theme park in California, and they were using recycled water there as a recreational park, and people were fishing. It's not licensed for fishing in Australia. So it's not new, so I thought I'd go through a little bit of the history of recycled water. So in 1897, Melbourne Water irrigated pasture for grazing with raw effluent, right? And they've been doing it ever since. Melbourne Water's Western Treatment Plant is the world's largest wastewater treatment plant, and it's the only treatment plant that's visible from space. So that'll give you a bit of an indication. It's 12,000 hectares of irrigation. So now they have lagoons there, but back in the early days and up until the 60s, they really just irrigated with raw effluent. You go through, in 1932, restorative effluent was for the city of San Francisco. Post-World War II, Israel commenced its reuse. They had to feed an expanding nation. Israel has a policy, if you call yourself a Jew, you have free right to migrate there. Early 50s, recycled water was first mooted for Virginia and South Australia, right? And it only took us until 1999 to turn the water on, so we acted promptly. Florida, you just go through them all. Carrots were grown on the Northern Adelaide Plains with Class C, D recycled water. So we had a class system for categorising our water. And they were grown, so if it was a root crop that was going to be washed and likely to be peeled, then they said that that was suitable for growing with this low-grade water. But mostly it was used for pasture and nut crops where there was no produce content. You go through 1985, irrigated oranges of recycled water in Orlando in Florida. It's really interesting in Florida. Florida is the second largest state with recycled water in America, following California. And what's interesting in Florida, recycled water is about getting rid of water, not conserving water. They have large development. Florida undergoes 600 families per week move to Florida. So they have a massive population expansion. So their problem was, in a really wet place, how do you get rid of water? So water recycling came up. The Australian National Academy of Science and National Research Council reviewed irrigation of food crops had no greater risk to health than conventionally irrigated crops. So the science backs this. Monterey in 1998, they developed their first major reuse project, dedicated reuse project. 1999, we in South Australia put forward Australia's most significant reuse project. It's the second largest agricultural reuse project in the world, so that'll give you a bit of an indication. And it's about to undergo another expansion of a further 12 gigalitres per annum. Gigalitres is 12,000 cubic metres, by the way. Wollonga Basin Water Company, they started irrigating with Class C. Now, Wollonga Basin is the McLaren Vale, and I don't know if you've ever seen wines from the McLaren Vale, but it is Australia's highest wine grape region, priced wine grape region. Sydney and Olympic Park, somebody went to Beijing. You didn't go to Sydney, did you? Well, Sydney, the Olympic Park had a third pipe scheme supplying recycled water for toilet flushing and for amenity irrigation. You go through it. In 2018, 90% of Israel's recycled water is now irrigated. Here are some guidelines, right, and different uses. I'm not going to go through all of that with you, but basically Class A recycled water comes under a language in Australia that says that it's fit for unrestricted agricultural irrigation. So that means there's no limitations. You can wash vegetables in the field with them. You can't wash vegetables in the shed, but you can wash vegetables in the field with recycled water. Basically, if you drink it, you're not going to get sick. These are just some of the major reuse projects around Australia. So we've got one in Alice Springs, and we reckon Adelaide's dry, but Alice Springs is worse. But when you consider the population of the state of South Australia, the amount of reuse we have is really significant. The Wollonga Basin Water Company, so Class C treated water going out to wine grape growers. They had an 80-kilometre pipeline network. Water is delivered to consumers under pressure. It's really interesting. I often compare and contrast the Virginia pipeline scheme with the Wollonga Basin project. They deliver under pressure. Virginia supplies 4 times more water, and they deliver it under low pressure, and they use 1/3 of the electricity. So when you're thinking about the designing of your scheme, think about those other aspects that are important to you. We've heard energy mentioned in the talk. Direct irrigation of wine grapes from the pipelines, and it was privately developed and self-funded. It's the only project that I know of that is a large-scale project that is privately developed and self-funded. Connection fee is $6,000 a megalitre, so if you're a farmer wanting 100 megalitres of water, you'll need $660,000, right? And this is paid over 6 years. They give them, and what they did was the Wollonga Basin Water Company took a bank guarantee so that they were guaranteed a payment. And the banks were happy to hand them out because the water put onto the property increased the value of the property so much. So when you're talking about funding your scheme and those things, and you talk about those areas of land in purple on previous maps, have a think about what the change in land value is that is accompanied with water. So the Wollonga Basin Water Company, $900 a megalitre currently is its supply cost. So each year the farmers pay. So if you've got 100 megalitres, it's going to cost you $900,000 a year. Customers penalised for taking too much water, they're disconnected and then they have to renegotiate a contract. The reason is because their system is a pressure supply, if a farmer takes too much water, then some other farmer misses out. have the first EPA licensed recycled MAR project. It was really interesting to hear about the managed aquifer recharge, but this is the first one in Australia. It's not the first project that's injecting recycled water into an aquifer, but it's the first one that actually has a full licence. That's basically to augment supply. So all of the thing about recycled water, it comes every month of the year in a temperate climate with winter-dominated rainfall like you have. Half the water was still going out to the ocean, so the idea was if they could get into MAR, they could inject the water into the ground and then extract it when they need it to augment the demand. Virginia, South Australia, this is the big project. 900 growers, significant to South Australia. 95 million of production farm gate at the start of the scheme. Value added to 230, worth to the state 350. But look, the reality of it is recycled water doubled the water available on the Northern Adelaide Plain. So you do the arithmetic and it's well worth it. It created a further 2,000 jobs. It brought new technologies to the region. It was funny, those numbers that were put up before it, I thought, how similar are those to the Northern Adelaide Plains? The Northern Adelaide Plains, that green triangle there, is roughly 14,000 hectares. There's 8 different soil types, but the predominantly irrigated soil type is a sandy clay loam with an underlying Blarchtown clay, which is highly sodic. So it's not without problems. It's in a 400 millimetre rainfall zone, irrigated since the late 40s, good quality groundwater, 18 gigalitres of that, and there's 19.5 gigalitres of recycled water delivered out to the region now. First major recycled water scheme in Australia, and you can just go through those things. There's 100 kilometres of pipeline. A coal eye, less than 1 coal eye per 100 mils of water, but the median is 0. The water is delivered to the farm storage. One of the things about the growers on the Northern Adelaide Plains, they often use their dam as part of their nutrient management program. So they put nitrogen in the dam so there could be no drawback if there was a problem. They made them have a dam with an air gap and the farmers irrigate from the dam. So the delivery pipe into the dam must sit above water level. Innovation Australia, which was Horticulture Australia, you have a horticulture industry. There's industry levy. They funded this first round of research, so the 5-year research program. So we always mention them, so they might give me another job. It was all about the sustainability of irrigation with recycled water. What we found out was that it wasn't a science issue, it was a social science issue. Can we irrigate with a brackish water? Yes. There's tons of stuff in the literature. Can we irrigate with water with nutrients in it? Yes, there's tons of stuff in the literature. Most of what we did was not about generating new science, it was actually about demonstrating it could be done in this region, right? Sustainably. And a lot of it was about building confidence. So the social science thing is I engaged 3 communication people to come into my company so that we could actually work on the communication side of this, because as communicators we found out we were incredibly good environmental toxicologists. And that was about the size of it. Is we found that talking about risk and talking about safety and things like that, as scientists, we use things like no significant risk. We never ever say no risk, it's no significant risk. And people were looking for certainty, so we needed to bring people in to help us with that. We run a program called the National Coordinator for Recycled Water Development and Horticulture. If you have a look at that website, my former business partner and myself ran that up until the project ends, so we did that for another 7 years. And if you go there, it's www.recycledwater.com.au. Bear in mind, when I get home, I'm actually going to put an enormous big disclaimer on it. We haven't updated that website probably for, 8 years. But the website's got all of the old guidelines on there. We produced a newsletter, and the newsletter was really important. And what we did was we just used Google Alerts to do the newsletter, because Google Alerts informed us when there was another article in the world that had been discussed around recycled water, so we would put that in. We promoted projects around Australia. So basically that project was there to build confidence and help farmers adopt recycled water. There's one aspect that I'll talk about. I'll mention it now, just in case I forget it later, is that If you're the early adopter of an agricultural recycled water scheme, as Virginia was in South Australia, you get an enormous funding advantage. So be the first adopter, make the decision, and if you're going to go ahead, because you'll find that there will be support from your government and things like that to prove that this is safe, right? And so you'll get all of the assistance. There was something like 4 major research projects on the Northern Adelaide Plains. I was contracted to the University of Adelaide and also to the Department of Primary Industries. I was also at that time contracted to be the executive officer for the horticulture industry in South Australia and sat on the National R&D Planning Committee. So I was able to get all of this recycled water stuff infiltrated into systems across Australia. But let me tell you, be the first adopter, it's the best place to be. We go down there and we have a look at this. So 14 years of recycled water. The soils, I went back 14 years later and reassessed the soils. There was no statistically significant, there you go, there's that word, no statistically significant change in the soils of the Northern Adelaide Plains, right? So salinity had remained the same. Everything had remained the same except for 2 parameters which weren't really affected by recycled water. One of them did, boron is associated with recycled water, but one of them was pH, soil pH. And that had changed, soil pH had increased. And we believe the driver for that was an increase in the groundwater level that's caused salinisation of the surface, change pH, and then that's mobilised boron, because those Blanchard clays that I mentioned before are high in boron. Not a problem, but it's something we need to keep an eye on. Perfection Fresh is one of the, I wish I put a capital there, Perfection Fresh is one of the world's largest greenhouse developments. 36 hectares, they're going to 50 hectares, right? And they're growing tomatoes. And their 2 water resources are just purely recycled water and the rainwater they get off of their roof. It's a tremendous product, and so that's Perfection Fresh there. They're all high technology greenhouses out of Holland. By the way, there's quite a few high technology greenhouses on the Northern Adelaide Plains out of New Zealand. We don't have a true high technology greenhouse manufacturer in Australia. The Virginia pipeline schemes, the impediments to development. To start off with, it was the growers. When we first started having the meeting, it was developed with private funding, government funding, and then was backed by research. But the biggest issue was the growers. So the growers on the Northern Adelaide Plains, there were 2 concerns. If I take recycled water, will it ruin my farm? If I take recycled water, will it ruin my market? And then if you were a grower who decided you weren't going to take recycled water, because there was 900 growers, and there's now only 300 customers taking recycled water, if you were a grower that wasn't taking recycled water, were you going to be branded as a recycled water user, and that would wreck your markets? Well, the answer to all of those things is no, but it took us a long time to work our way through that, and it was interesting. The company that developed the scheme was a company called WRSV, Water Reticulation Systems Virginia. And WRSV, I was sitting in Tony White's office one day, and one of the biggest naysayers about the reuse scheme that used to come along to the meeting and say, no, this is going to wreck everything. I was sitting in Tony's office today, he walked in and asked if he could have 100 megalitres of water. And I said to Morris, I said, a bit of a change in attitude. And he said, oh, well, I look through the fence, everybody else is making money out of it. It's good enough for them, good enough for me. We had meetings, we invited the 16 retail chains in Australia to come to a meeting. And out of those 16 retail chains, we sent them a package, a pre-meeting package. One company turned up, and it was a locally based IGA, Independent Grocery Association, they turned up. All the others didn't bother to turn up. Basically, if the Department of Health signed off on it, they were happy. So they were willing to accept the science. So if the Department of Health signed off, then they were happy. Growers now accept recycled water as another water resource. One of the things that, for me was, I'm a bit opposed to just branding something as Class A recycled water. I'd like to use lower quality water so that you can use more qualities. But one of the risks attached to that I learned as I go on, and now I'm probably a Class A recycled water man, is the fact that after a little while, the growers don't even consider it as recycled water, it's just water. And the reality of it is just water. There's nothing special about it. It's been treated, so it's been treated in a plant rather than in the environment, because we know water gets recycled around the world in the hydrological cycle. We know that happens. It's treated in a plant rather than in the environment, and it's just another water resource. It's that simple. So I'm not going to go through all of that. That's a bit of rubbish. That'll give you a bit of stuff. Originally, we were allowed 10 NTU with the Northern Adelaide Plains, but we had 360 hectares of solar lagoons as part of the treatment process. So the Virginia, the Bolivar wastewater treatment plant had big lagoons. So we were allowed 10, the results were 2. That's now been reduced. I've cut the lagoons in half because I had problems with midge. And by cutting the lagoons in half, I got half the midge. And so that was essentially the size of it. The salinity is set at 1500 TDS and averages around 1100, right? And the E. coli at that time is much lower now. The E. coli now has to be less than 10 E. coli per 100 mils. Is actually its median value is 0. Compare and contrast, we won't go into that. Low pressure on farms, 16, the water contracted. To start the project, they had to have 16 gigalitres of water contracted. They got it. A company took 8 gigalitres of water, half of the water volume. They went broke. So just as the scheme got up, we lost half our customers, but only took us 6 months to get rid of that water. Once the scheme got up and running, then the customers came to it. So this idea of build and they will come. Crop requirements for the Wollonga Basin. This is really interesting. The price I gave you for the Wollonga Basin, the 900, the Virginia pipeline scheme, they're paying around 160 now. It's a funny thing, when you do the arithmetic on the amount of water that they used, the cost per crop was roughly the same. So it's actually not the price per megalitre. You really have to do a lot of work around the business case for water recycling, but not just the business case of the treatment and delivery of the water. You have to do a lot of work. You have to do it and feed that information into the farmers, that they have a business case that says their farm can afford this. And I've spent the last 8 years doing nothing but economic models for people. I'll get this going the right way. Virginia pipeline scheme, impediments. We've been through some of those. The one about produce and markets was a really interesting thing. We were into the Virginia pipeline scheme 3 months, and all of a sudden a big hullabaloo came out of the Melbourne markets. There was produce in the Melbourne markets that had been grown with recycled water that had been rejected. So on a plane we fly over to Melbourne, we get out, and what do we find out? A, the produce didn't come from Virginia. B, they hadn't been irrigated with recycled water, and the damage was insect damage. But it did create a bit of a stink for a while, so we dealt with that as we went forward. Am I going in the right direction? What am I doing? Oh, here we go. So there's the water quality. If you look at the Class A recycled water column, it's quite similar to the water that was available on the Northern Adelaide Plains. We have 2 resource aquifer, tertiary aquifer 1 and tertiary aquifer 2, and the water quality was quite the same in many regards. There was both better and worse water. So what were the drivers for Virginia? 3 major drivers. We heard today about water resources being over-allocated. The water resource on the Northern Adelaide Plains was over-allocated, and we're getting saltwater intrusion from the outside, right? Saline water intrusion. So we needed another water resource. Farmers wanted more water to grow their businesses. You know that thing about farming, get big or get out? Well, farmers wanted more water so they could grow their business. The third one was that we were killing seagrass. They reckon 4,000 hectares of seagrass was damaged by the discharge of effluent water into the ocean. And this seagrass, we have a fish in Australia called whiting, King George whiting. It's the best fish by a long shot in South Australia. If you go there and see King George whiting, try it. It was the breeding grounds for the King George whiting. But what was miraculous, science is an incredible thing, but what was miraculous was when somebody had worked out the value of the damage to the seagrass, it was exactly the same price as building the water treatment plant for recycled water. So I don't know how that came about, but it was a magic number. Managing environmental risks. There are risks. This water has a high SAR, sodium absorption ratio. So the risks are salinisation, and you go through it, soil structural decline, and then you have the salinisation of crops, so leaf burn, and then you get heavy metals and contaminants are concerned. So we'll go through these. That's what you do. So if I'm growing a spud crop in a dry year, I'll be putting on over 8 tonne of salt per crop. So you've got to work out where that 8 tonne of salt, it's fine, you have to work out where it's going to go. So it's not just a matter of saying, let's irrigate, let's do it. You need the environmental work, and that's what we actually did. So there are the nutrients. In 1 megalitre of recycled water on the Northern Adelaide Plains, there is $150 worth of nutrients. So all of a sudden, you're talking about recycling and sustainability. Here is a soluble nutrient that's virtually 100% usable. And what we found out was that the leaching below crops grown with recycled water was dramatically less than the leaching below those crops grown in the conventional method, right? So it actually had a very good environmental outcome. So we stopped putting all that nutrient out in the Gulf St Vincent, and we brought it back on land that had an economic benefit for the farmers. We brought the water back on land and they could grow their businesses, and also we had an economic benefit on the groundwater system. Percentage of nutrients. So here are the crops and they're the percentage of nutrients. So if we had a cabbage crop, we're overplying nearly double the amount of potassium was going onto that crop from recycled water. So there's roughly 50 milligrams per kilogram per litre of potassium in recycled water. So you go down to capsicums, 400%, and you come down. But you look at celery and potatoes and tomatoes are the biggest crop on the Northern Adelaide Plains. 33% of their potassium requirements. So the blue ones, I could have made them red, but people get a bit dramatic about red, so I didn't. So what did we do? On the Northern Adelaide Plains, we had virgin soils that had been irrigated for a long time with bore water, and soils that had been irrigated with recycled water. So we did the research. The recycled water was more, we increased the salinity, but what we found out was we decreased salinity with depth, right? What about soils with SAR, sodium absorption ratio, ESP? So it's when the soil gets loaded with sodium, it undergoes structural decline because it's a monovalent cation, not a divalent cation, right? So soils become dispersive. We're on the borderline, but what we found out on the Northern Adelaide Plains, that in the short to medium term, this is in our original search, in the short to medium term, growing crops with recycled water was sustainable because every farmer on the Northern Adelaide Plains that grew a root crop would put on a tonne of organic matter every year, a tonne of compost, and he would put on a tonne of gypsum every year. So the gypsum would flocculate the soil, so this effect had been mitigated, right? But this is why you need to do the research. You need to understand what the farmers are doing now and then what the farmers are going to be doing when you use the recycled water. So we looked at the effects of boron, and you can see we got elevated boron, and see how high the boron is in the subsoil. That's that Blanchetown clay that we spoke about. But from a virgin soil, we reduced boron levels. Boron's not been an issue on the Northern Adelaide Plains with respect to irrigation with recycled water. But it's something we need to keep an eye on. The effect on pH, yes, it did increase soil pH because the water has a pH of roughly 8. And so therefore, irrigation will tell you the soil properties will tend towards the water quality when you irrigate. So if you have water with elevated pH, the soil properties will go to an elevated pH in time. Understanding irrigation water, just like any other water resource. Do not make any other mistake. It is just like every other water resource. So that water resource is, you need to look at its salinity, you need to look at its quality, you need to look at its suitability. So the language we now use under the new guidelines is fit for purpose, right? Heavy metals. Another thing, the farmers, what about all the cadmium in recycled water? We know it's there, the copper. So we needed to go out with. One of the things we found out about heavy metals is heavy metals, because of their charge, attach themselves to the organic fraction in the wastewater, and then when you filter the organic fraction out, you remove all of the heavy metals. So when we look at it, recycled water, look at the level of cadmium in recycled water. We had to concentrate up the water tenfold before we could measure it. So we had to put it in an oven and evaporate off 90% of the water before we could measure it. Look at the irrigation water criteria compared to the recycled water value. Look at the drinking water criteria, the marine water criteria. So virtually no cadmium. Copper was another one. You get a lot of copper in recycled water because of the copper pipes used in housing and the chlorine used for disinfection. So the chlorine dissolves the copper and ends up in your wastewater. So story is exactly the same. Endocrine disruptors, this is a big one. Does everybody here, put up your hand if you know what an endocrine disruptor is. We got a few. Right, so an endocrine disruptor is a hormone mimicking compound. In other words, it's a compound that's not natural that mimics a hormone in your body. So in recycled water, you get estrogen and progesterone and all of these hormones. The biggest source of endocrine disruptors in wastewater come from the manufacturing and plastic industry, right? So we have it in there. Have a look at it. The amount in 2 litres of wastewater at a treatment plant is equal to 0.08% of the normal daily intake of endocrine disruptors in food. So it's not an issue, but the number of people that bought this up, the compounds are concerned in recycled water. Look, they're there, but what you have to do is address it with fact, and you have to get the best people. You have to communicate this. So managing the constraints, trust, thought and help. Trust is a big one. So when you're going out to talk to people, who do they trust? So one of the things is that Circualr, our Commonwealth research organisation, they went and did a study about recycled water and who people trust and that sort of thing. And the community trusted Circualr most of all. We thought that might have been loaded. Then came the universities, and then way down the bottom came government. They don't trust government at all. So when you're going out there to give your message about water recycling and talking to people and trying to allay their fears, first of all, you have to listen to them. That's your first step. And do understand that somebody else's perception is reality in their mind. So just don't fob them off. So patiently work with the people in the community and go forward. So you've got to do the trust, you've got to think about what you're going to do, and then you've got to go and get the help that you need to deliver the message. I am a shocking writer. I am profoundly dyslexic, so if there's spelling errors in this, I make no apologies, right? I spent my life writing stuff, and we wrote fact sheet, we wrote bulletin, we wrote stuff for newspapers. We created 6, does anybody know what Landline is? Landline is the agricultural, the most watched agricultural what's happening in farming program run by the ABC in Australia. So we made 6 episodes on Landline, on water recycling. We would be rung up virtually when we're doing the research weekly for somebody to ask us a comment about water recycling. We made ourselves available. We brought international visitors out, the same as you've done here today. You might have found a better quality one if you looked harder though. When we discuss risk, how do you explain risk to somebody? The risk of getting a disease from eating produce grown with Class A recycled water is 1 in 10 million. Put up your hand if you understand what that means. Good crowd. So we used to get out there and someone would say, oh, I don't know what that means, but can you guarantee I'm not going to get ill? And we'd say, no, scientists don't guarantee that stuff, right? So we just don't guarantee it. So this is where we had to bring in a communication team. I was sitting down trying to work out how I might explain risk to people. So I thought, well, the best thing is to start off with things I know. So having asthma. So in 10 million people, there's 1,100,000, right, go on. Diabetes. Being robbed. I only got robbed last week, just after Christmas. Somebody broke in the house, stole my 2 cars and a heap of stuff. And so I'm now in that 11,889 people. Killed in a car accident, dying of skin cancer, accidentally drowning, struck by lightning, 7 in 10 million people. Winning First Division Cross Lotto in South Australia, 1.2 in 10 million. If that doesn't put you off a Cross Lotto, nothing will. And then we get down to viruses. How am I going for time? Who's the time master? Are you the timekeeper? Yeah. How am I doing?
About 7 or 8 minutes.
Oh, we can do heaps of that. Impacts on markets. When I spoke to the managing team for this project, they wanted me to come up with stuff on markets, and I had a good look around, and I said, I can't give you much. Then I thought, don't be lazy, get off your bum and have a look around. And I got off my bum and I had a look around, and the answer was still the same. I couldn't find anything in Australia. Produce grown with recycled water is not identified. Growers in the Werribee district, that's since the Virginia district, growing with recycled water, they now put on their box that this produce has been sustainably produced with a truly renewable water resource. So the farmers are now proud of their use of recycled water. They're not scared of it at all. So I had a look around. Northern Adelaide Plains delivers food locally, exports food nationally, and then exports food internationally. You can bet your bottom dollar that some of the produce going overseas is grown with recycled water because it's 50% of the water resource on the Northern Adelaide Plains. Case studies in the Salinas Valley in California. So that's the Monterey water pollution, the Monterey, I've got a great name for a wastewater treatment plant. Monterey Regional Water Pollution Control Agency. I just love it. I think we've got to go. It's not a wastewater treatment plant anymore, guys. It's a water pollution control. So we went there and had a look at their scheme, right? Now their scheme is quite different, and they're using water for different things. But what they do is that they essentially took groundwater licences back off the farmers. How do you reckon you go with that, folks? They took the groundwater licences off the farmers, and then they supplied them a combination of groundwater and recycled water. And their recycled water scheme was designed on the size that they could supply 100% of their winter produced water, right? So the scheme was oversized, the scheme was undersized for summer, but it did mean that they could use all this water in winter time, right? So there wasn't enough water in summertime, and they did it. So basically what they did was they put wells out at the end of it, and then they injected water back. So they used the farmers' groundwater licences to supply them with 100% of their water requirement by integrating the recycled water in their groundwater system, right? So it was a very interesting thing. So there's 65,000 acres. I just got this off of their statistics. So since they've got recycled water out there, there have been two significant changes. They've grown from 65,000 acres of irrigation to 119, so nearly doubled. So they bought recycled water there as a resource, and they've started some drain diversions, which they're injecting into the aquifer, as a water resource as well, right? So have a look at those. The Salinas Valley. I was able to get some produce statistics off of the Salinas Valley. So that's what they grow. Lettuce, they're big croppers, lettuce, strawberry, broccoli, cauliflower, you go through them. And these are the amounts that they exported, right? So their scheme started the year before Virginia in 1998, so off they go. These are the countries that they export to. Now, somebody mentioned about the cultural issue of growing stuff with recycled water. The Middle East is very big on that. So if you're a Muslim, some Muslims won't even walk on grass grown with recycled water. So you have to be respectful of that cultural thing. You absolutely have to be respectful of it, and you have to work with that community to either bring them along on the ride and change their mind, or be respectful that their opinion is as valid as my opinion as a scientist, or your opinion as a regulator, or your opinion as a scheme designer, or your opinion as a grower. Their right to their opinion is just as valuable. And that's the one thing I really learned was in doing this project was I needed to stop and listen to people and what they had to say, and then give them the reasons why I thought like I thought, but listen to their reasons why they thought. So, but you go through here and look at all of these different countries that took produce grown from recycled water. So I would suggest we have seen no market impact on produce grown in recycled water in Australia. There has been no international backlash from markets growing produce with recycled water that produce is exported, right? And the Salinas Valley is probably a good example, but the best example in the world, and I didn't get numbers for it, is Israel. They are big suppliers of food into Europe. Europe have the most stringent guidelines. Europe GAP have the most stringent import guidelines for produce in the world. And Israel exports, so 90% of their wastewater goes into irrigation of food crops, or they don't irrigate pasture, no, it'd be food crops, for food crops. So I think you can say that any fear around market is not founded. It's an emotional reaction that if I am a farmer, the most important thing to me, if I look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right up the top in the little triangle at the top, will be market access. Because without market access, I haven't got a show. We wrote a new set of guidelines. So this is one of the things that Aris did. We were contracted by the government to write a new set of guidelines. First time in the world in a risk assessment approach. So instead of saying, here's a number, you have to be below that, what we said was, every scheme should be assessed on the crops it grows, on the soil types, and a risk assessment be undertaken. So that you manage risks in a proactive way, and the risk assessment is going. I personally think it's 400 pages of pure gold. But if you're looking, anybody here is an insomniac, get a copy, you can download it, read it, and you'll be off to sleep in no time at all. It can be safe for any water resource. So there's just a standard risk assessment. It's not even related to this project, it's another project I was doing. But here you come about it, indicative pathogen reduction. So what we need to meet is a 6.5 log reduction in pathogens, right? So here is a bunch of treatment systems. So you can come through these treatment systems. And then you come through here, wetlands. So in South Australia, one of the really good MAR projects just uses a wetland to treat the water, right? And so UV light, chlorination, you look at all these different treatment chains and that will give you the log reductions for them. If I build a water treatment plant, I can't just go, oh, I've got secondary treatment, so therefore I'm going to get somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5 for Giardia. What I have to do is I have to validate that, right? So I've got to go through the building of the pilot plant, I've got to validate it, and then I move forward, okay? Don't take a photo, you can have the presentation. Here is the interesting one under the new guidelines, and these ones don't have to be validated, these are given. Log reductions, what we call on-site controls. So if I am a farmer and the produce I'm growing is going to be cooked or processed, I get 6.5 log reduction, a 5 to 6 log reduction. So I only need primary treated effluent and I can irrigate my crops, spuds, and I can get my 5.6. So there, add them together, I've got the 6.5 log reduction, away I go. Drip irrigation. So if I'm a farmer in a region, you don't have to treat your water to be, the more you treat it, the more it costs. You just can't get away from that. So what you need to do is look at the crop. So if you've got kiwi fruit here, by the way, not my favourite fruit, kiwi fruit, a bit slimy, you guys, you need to straighten that out. But if you've got drip irrigation on plants and shrubs, 4 log reduction, you get 4 log reduction, the drip irrigation's on the ground and your kiwi fruit's up here. Tomatoes are the same. So you can work through your system and look at your crops. And I would suggest that this is something that your team should be looking at. And if you need help with it, we went around Australia running a round-robin training program on training regulators in the national guidelines. But if you need a hand, this is really interesting to look at, because what you can actually do is sit down there and say, how do we provide the cheapest water that still provides all of the environmental and health safety aspects that we want? This is the process. You go through this process and away you go. So you look at the different things. Subsurface irrigation above ground crops, 4 log reduction. Withholding periods. So if you're growing potatoes in Kuirup in Victoria and you're using recycled water, they store those potatoes for up to 6 months and you get 0.5 log reduction a day. So you can just irrigate them with recycled water and just forget about it. So you go down, so you look at your different crops. Of course, if you're growing cucumbers that ripen every day, their shelf life is very much, strawberry shelf life is only 7 days. So if you're growing strawberries, you're not going to get many log reduction with a withholding period. So you've got to sit down and look at your crop and then work your way through that process, okay? Buffer zones, that's a log 1 reduction for aerosols essentially, right? Getting the balance right. This is probably my favourite slide. I'm scared of heights, so there's no way I'll be irritating that guy, but that's amazing. That's an amazing piece of architecture, isn't it? Drivers, political, economic, regulatory, social, environmental, market and scientific. They're your list. And you had most of your list in the presentation from the council versus a sustainable system. Don't look just at the sustainability of agriculture. Don't just look at the sustainability of not discharging wastewater into your bay. Don't look at the sustainability, the upstream sustainability of your natural water systems if you bring recycled water on and those sorts of things. Do a full assessment on it, environmentally, economically and socially, right? That's it for me. You've probably heard enough.